The radio in Stalag 7A, the twisted copper wire, looked like nothing more than scrap metal in the pale morning light filtering through the barracks window. Staff Sergeant Jake McNasty, McNiece, turned the salvaged radio component over in his calloused fingers, studying the vacuum tube he'd lifted from the commandant's broken loudspeaker 3 days earlier. Around him, 43 American paratroopers from the 506th PIR stirred restlessly on their straw pallets, another sleepless night at Stalag 7A behind them. 6 weeks into captivity outside Munich, McNiece had watched good men begin to fold inward like broken parachutes. The Germans fed them watery soup and sawdust bread, but the real starvation was information. No news from home. No word about the war's progress, just the steady drip of propaganda from the camp loudspeakers and the mechanical precision of guards who seemed to take quiet satisfaction in their prisoners' growing despair. McNiece had built his reputation with TNT and detonation cord, turning farmhouse materials into devastating charges that could drop a bridge or clear a roadblock. But here, surrounded by wire and watchtowers, his demolition skills meant nothing. The only explosives that mattered now were the small acts of defiance that might blow apart the suffocating hopelessness settling over his fellow prisoners. "You really think that junk's gonna work, McNasty?" Private Kowalski whispered from the next bunk, eyeing the growing collection of electronic components McNiece had been gathering for weeks. "They laughed when I told them I could blow the Douve River Bridge with a cigarette lighter and some fence wire," McNiece replied quietly, not looking up from his work. "Now they're laughing at this. But if it works?" The radio project had started as pure stubbornness, McNiece's refusal to accept that the Germans controlled every scrap of information that reached them. While other prisoners focused on escape tunnels or black market cigarette trading, he'd begun studying the camp's electrical systems during work details, applying the same methodical improvisation he'd once used to rig charges under impossible conditions in the Norman hedgerows. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber paused at the foot of McNiece's bunk during morning inspection, his flashlight beam lingering on the scattered components. A former electrical engineer from Dresden, Weber possessed enough technical knowledge to recognize amateur radio construction when he saw it. But instead of confiscating the materials, he seemed genuinely curious about McNiece's resourcefulness. "Interesting project," the German guard said in careful English, examining a length of antenna wire McNiece had threaded through a crack in the wall. "Very creative use of available materials." McNiece met Weber's gaze steadily, prepared for whatever punishment awaited, but Weber simply nodded and continued his inspection, leaving the radio components untouched. In that moment, something shifted between captor and captive, a recognition that some forms of hope transcended the artificial boundaries their uniforms represented. The morning work whistle echoed across the compound, calling prisoners to another day of pointless labor, designed more to break spirits than accomplish anything useful. But as McNiece carefully wrapped his radio components in a torn piece of undershirt, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These men had followed him through the chaos of D-Day and the bloody fields of Normandy. Now in this place, where explosions were forbidden and rebellion seemed impossible, he would find another way to keep fighting. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, during a thunderstorm that masked the sound of McNiece's delicate work. Rain hammered the tin roof of the barracks while he crouched in the corner, his hands moving with the same careful precision he'd once used to thread detonation cord through the steel girders of a German railroad bridge. The radio receiver, cobbled together from stolen mess kit parts and copper wire stripped from the camp's electrical system, looked like mechanical suicide to most eyes. "McNasty, that contraption's gonna get us all shot," Kowalski muttered, watching McNiece adjust the crude antenna he'd rigged through a gap in the barracks wall. The other prisoners huddled closer, despite their fear, their gaunt faces reflecting weeks of subsisting on watery soup and sawdust bread that left them perpetually hollow with hunger. McNiece didn't respond immediately. His fingers probed the vacuum tubes, salvaged from Weber's broken loudspeaker, testing connections with the methodical patience that had made him legendary among the filthy 13. Back in Normandy, he'd learned to trust his hands when his eyes couldn't penetrate the smoke and chaos. Here, in the grey monotony of Stalag 7A, those same hands offered the only hope of breaking through the suffocating isolation the Germans used as a weapon. The psychological warfare was more sophisticated than most prisoners realized. The constant broadcasts of propaganda, the deliberate withholding of news from home, the calculated silence designed to make them feel forgotten. It was all part of a systematic effort to break down resistance without firing a shot. McNiece had watched strong paratroopers begin to question whether the war was even still being fought, whether anyone back home remembered they existed. Private Danny Sullivan, barely 20 and captured on his first combat jump into Normandy, sat on the bunk opposite McNiece's workspace. The kid had volunteered for the paratroopers to impress a girl back in Boston, but 6 weeks of captivity had drained the boyish enthusiasm from his face, leaving behind hollow eyes that spoke of dreams slowly dying. "Sarge," Sullivan said quietly, "what if there ain't nothing out there to hear? What if the war's over and we just don't know it yet?" The question hung in the damp air like a prayer offered without faith. Around them, other prisoners stopped their quiet conversations, waiting for McNiece's response. They'd followed him through the terrifying uncertainty of scattered night drops and the brutal reality of hedgerow fighting. Now they needed something from him that TNT and detonation cord couldn't provide. "Sullivan," McNiece said, still focused on his radio work, but speaking loud enough for the others to hear, "You ever see me give up on a charge just because the fuse looked wet, or the timing seemed impossible?" "No, Sarge." "Then don't start doubting now. This thing's going to work because it has to work. Because 43 American paratroopers deserve to know they ain't been forgotten." Weber appeared during evening inspection, his footsteps unusually quiet on the wooden floor. Instead of the perfunctory sweep most guards performed, he approached McNiece's corner with obvious interest. The German examined the radio components with professional curiosity, his engineer's eye taking in the crude but functional construction. "Frequency stability will be poor," Weber observed in his careful English. "But under these conditions—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Sometimes even guards need to know how the war progresses." The moment stretched between them, captor and captive, united briefly by shared humanity and the uncertain future that awaited them all. Weber's decision to leave the radio intact became an unspoken acknowledgement that hope, like radio waves, couldn't be contained by wire fences and watchtowers. The first breakthrough came at 0200 hours on a fog-shrouded morning in late September, when atmospheric conditions finally aligned with McNiece's improvised antenna configuration. Through a maze of static and interference that seemed to mock their desperation, the BBC's familiar interval signal emerged from the crude speaker, 4 clear notes that might as well have been a symphony to the men gathered around McNiece's bunk. The news that followed was fragmentary but electrifying. Allied forces advancing through France, German defensive lines cracking under pressure, liberation armies pushing deeper into occupied Europe. For the first time in weeks, genuine smiles appeared on faces that had grown accustomed to displaying only careful neutrality. Men who had begun to sink into the grey despair of indefinite captivity suddenly stood straighter, spoke more boldly, carried themselves with renewed dignity. Private Sullivan, the kid from Boston who'd been questioning whether anyone remembered they existed, listened with tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. The radio had become more than an electronic device. It was proof that the world beyond Stalag 7A's wire fences continued to turn, that their sacrifice in the Norman hedgerows hadn't been forgotten. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Sullivan whispered as the BBC announcer described Allied advances toward the German border. "They're still fighting for us. They're coming." McNiece felt a familiar weight settling in his chest, the same responsibility he'd carried through scattered night drops and desperate bridge demolitions in Normandy. These men had followed him into impossible situations because they trusted his ability to improvise solutions when official plans fell apart. Now, in this place where his demolition skills meant nothing, he'd found another way to keep them fighting. But success brought its own dangers. Word of the radio's existence had begun to spread beyond their barracks, carried in whispered conversations during work details and meal lines. Other prisoners approached with desperate requests for specific information, news from their home states, updates on units they'd served with, any scrap of evidence that their families hadn't given them up for dead. The moral complexity of their situation weighed heavily on McNiece. Operating the radio required cooperation from prisoners who risked severe punishment if caught, but it also offered something invaluable: connection to a world beyond the psychological warfare of propaganda broadcasts and calculated isolation. Each transmission was a gamble that could cost 43 lives, but those same lives were slowly dying anyway, under the weight of enforced despair. Weber's reaction to discovering the radio's success surprised everyone. During a routine inspection, he'd caught them listening to a broadcast from London, the telltale glow of vacuum tubes visible in the darkened barracks. Standing in the doorway with the device in his hands, he examined McNiece's handiwork with the critical eye of a professional engineer. "Poor frequency stability," Weber said finally, setting the radio down gently, almost reverently. "But the construction shows intelligence, resourcefulness." The German guard's voice carried a note McNiece hadn't heard before, something approaching respect, perhaps even admiration. Weber had spent his pre-war career designing electrical systems in Dresden, building things that brought light and communication to German homes. Now he found himself guarding men whose determination to maintain hope reminded him of qualities he'd once valued in himself. "Perhaps," Weber added quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure they weren't overheard, "sometimes guards also need to understand how the world changes beyond these fences." The weeks that followed established a carefully maintained routine. McNiece operated his radio during thunderstorms and heavy fog when atmospheric conditions provided both better reception and natural sound masking. Weber's evening inspections became opportunities for brief, cryptic conversations about technical improvements and frequency adjustments. Discussions that skirted the edges of fraternization while maintaining the fiction of proper guard-prisoner relations. The radio's psychological impact extended far beyond the news it provided. Men who had begun to question their worth, their purpose, their very identity as soldiers rediscovered something to fight for. The device became a symbol of resistance, ingenuity, and the stubborn refusal to surrender hope. Qualities that defined not just McNiece, but the best traditions of the airborne units they'd served with in Normandy. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The test came in early October, when Oberfuhrer Heinrich Krauss arrived from Berlin to conduct a surprise inspection of Stalag 7A's security protocols. Unlike Weber and the regular camp guards, Krauss represented the hard edge of Nazi ideology, a man who viewed prisoner management as psychological warfare and any sign of resistance as proof that harsher measures were needed. McNiece had been expecting this moment since the radio project began. You couldn't maintain something this valuable, this dangerous, without eventually facing a reckoning. As he listened to Krause's jackboots echoing through the compound during morning formation, he felt the same cold certainty he'd experienced before rigging charges on the Douve River Bridge in Normandy, the knowledge that everything depended on the next few decisions. All electronic devices, musical instruments, and unauthorized materials will be surrendered immediately, Krause announced through a translator, his voice carrying the mechanical authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Any prisoner found concealing contraband will face severe disciplinary action, as will his barracks mates. The threat was clear: collective punishment. If they found the radio, everyone in the barracks would pay the price. McNiece watched 43 faces around him, seeing the fear warring with determination. These men had trusted him with their morale, their hope, their connection to the world beyond the wire. Now he had to decide whether to protect them by destroying what he'd built or risk everything to maintain their lifeline to sanity. Private Sullivan caught his eye from across the barracks, the young Bostonian who'd questioned whether anyone still remembered they existed. The kid nodded slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both understanding and permission. Whatever McNiece decided, they'd follow his lead. Weber appeared in the doorway, his usual evening inspection replaced by Krause's systematic search protocol. But something in the German engineer's manner had changed. Instead of his normal methodical examination, Weber moved with subtle urgency, his eyes meeting McNiece's briefly before scanning the corner where the radio components lay hidden beneath loose floorboards. "This barracks appears to be in acceptable condition," Weber reported to Krause in rapid German, his voice betraying nothing unusual. "No contraband visible, all prisoners accounted for and cooperative." McNiece felt his breath catch. Weber was actively concealing the radio's existence, risking his own career and possibly his life to protect something he'd helped nurture through technical advice and willful blindness. The German engineer had made his choice, crossing a line that transformed him from captor to reluctant ally. But Krause wasn't satisfied with surface inspections. He ordered a complete dismantling of the barracks. Floorboards pulled up, mattresses stripped, every hiding place exposed to methodical scrutiny. When his search team reached McNiece's corner, the radio components lay exposed, like the guts of some mechanical creature, impossible to explain away as innocent tinkering. "What is this?" Krause demanded, holding up the crude antenna wire that had carried voices from London through months of desperate nights. McNiece stood slowly, feeling every eye in the barracks focused on him. This was the moment he'd been preparing for since the project began, not just the discovery, but the reckoning that would determine whether his improvisation had been worth the risk. The same weight he'd carried while timing charges in Normandy now pressed against his chest, the responsibility for lives that depended on his next words. "It's a radio, sir," McNiece said quietly, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone he'd used to report demolished bridges and cleared roadblocks. "I built it from salvaged parts to monitor news broadcasts for prisoner morale purposes." The admission hung in the air like cordite smoke after an explosion. Around him, 43 American paratroopers waited to learn whether their months of hope had condemned them to punishment that would break more than their spirits. Weber stood rigid at attention, his face revealing nothing of the internal struggle that had led him to this moment of shared risk. Krause examined the radio components with the cold precision of a man cataloguing evidence for a court-martial. But when he looked up at McNiece, something unexpected flickered in his eyes. Not admiration exactly, but a recognition of the technical skill and determination required to build a functioning receiver under such conditions. What happened next would never appear in any official report, though the memory would follow McNiece through decades of restless nights and the phantom sound of radio static that occasionally invaded his dreams. Oberfuhrer Krause examined the improvised radio components for several long minutes, his fingers tracing the connections McNiece had soldered with salvaged wire and desperate ingenuity. The silence stretched until it felt like the moment before a detonation, when time suspended itself between anticipation and destruction. "Sergeant McNiece," Krauss said finally, his English precise and coldly formal, "this device represents a serious violation of camp regulations and international protocols governing prisoner communications." McNiece nodded, accepting the inevitable. He'd known this moment would come since the first night he'd pulled radio signals from the static, had accepted the risk as the price of maintaining hope among men who'd begun to question whether they'd been forgotten by their own army. The weight of responsibility he'd carried through scattered night drops and desperate bridge demolitions in Normandy had prepared him for this final reckoning. But Krauss wasn't finished. He turned the crude speaker over in his hands, studying the vacuum tubes McNiece had salvaged from Weber's broken equipment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note that surprised everyone in the barracks. However, the technical sophistication required to construct a functioning receiver under these conditions demonstrates considerable engineering skill, perhaps even ingenuity worthy of respect. The words hung in the air like a prayer answered in an unexpected language. Around the barracks, 43 American paratroopers held their breath, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever strange mercy was unfolding before them. Weber stood rigid at attention, his face revealing nothing of the internal conflict that had led him to conceal the radio's existence for weeks. McNiece felt something shifting in his chest, not relief exactly, but a recognition that the war had created moral complexities that couldn't be resolved through standard military protocols. Here, in a German prison camp outside Munich, enemy officers were acknowledging the same stubborn determination and improvisational skill that had made him legendary among the Filthy 13 during their wildest demolition missions in Normandy. "The device will remain confiscated," Krauss continued, setting the radio components on McNiece's bunk with unexpected care. "But perhaps it should be studied by technical personnel before final disposal. Such examination might require several weeks of detailed analysis." The euphemism was clear enough. The radio would disappear from official inventory while continuing to function under careful supervision. Krauss was offering something unprecedented: tacit permission to maintain their connection to the outside world, wrapped in bureaucratic language that provided plausible deniability for everyone involved. Private Sullivan, the young Bostonian who'd questioned whether anyone still remembered their existence, looked at McNiece with something approaching awe. The kid had watched his sergeant improvise solutions to impossible problems throughout their capture and imprisonment. But this negotiation with enemy authority represented a different kind of courage, one that required trusting former enemies to honor the unspoken rules of human decency that occasionally transcended wartime hatred. "There is one condition," Krauss added, his voice returning to its earlier formality. "Any news received through this device must be shared equally among all prisoners, regardless of rank, unit affiliation, or personal preferences. Information is not to be hoarded or used for individual advantage." McNiece nodded his agreement, understanding that Krauss was essentially asking him to continue serving as the barracks' informal morale officer, a responsibility he'd been carrying anyway, but now with official acknowledgement from his captors. The German officer was recognizing something the U.S. Army had sometimes struggled to accept, that McNiece's greatest value came not from following regulations, but from his willingness to improvise solutions when standard procedures failed to serve the men who depended on him. Weber spoke for the first time during the entire inspection, addressing Krauss in rapid German that McNiece couldn't follow. But the engineer's tone conveyed respect, perhaps even admiration, for the technical achievement the radio represented. When Weber glanced at McNiece, his eyes carried a message that transcended language barriers, professional recognition between two men who understood the satisfaction of building something functional from discarded materials, and stubborn determination. The secret McNiece would carry for decades wasn't just that enemy officers had allowed him to maintain his radio project. It was the recognition that war's deepest truths couldn't be found in propaganda broadcasts or official reports, but in moments when human decency survived despite uniforms, flags, and the artificial hatred governments manufactured to justify sending young men to kill each other. The liberation of Stalag 7A came on April 29, 1945, when Patton's Third Army tanks rolled through the camp gates like mechanized thunder, announcing the end of a long nightmare. McNiece stood among the 43 American paratroopers who had shared his radio project, watching German guards raise their hands in surrender to men wearing the same uniform he'd worn during those desperate weeks in the Norman hedgerows. But the moment that would stay with him longest occurred just before the camp's surrender, when Weber approached him during what everyone knew would be their final inspection. The German engineer carried McNiece's radio components, carefully wrapped in the same torn undershirt that had protected them through months of secret broadcasts. "This should return to its builder," Weber said quietly, offering the device that had sustained hope through the darkest period of their captivity. "Perhaps someday, when the world makes sense again, you will remember that enemies can also be engineers who simply want to build something useful." McNiece accepted the radio, feeling its familiar weight in his hands, not heavy like the TNT satchels he'd carried through Normandy, but substantial enough to anchor memories that would follow him through decades of civilian life. The device represented more than successful improvisation. It embodied the stubborn refusal to surrender hope that had defined his service with the Filthy 13 and his survival as a prisoner of war. The reunion with American forces brought celebration, medical examinations, and lengthy debriefings that reduced their months of imprisonment to bureaucratic categories. Prisoner identification numbers, medical conditions, intelligence value of information gathered during captivity, but no report would capture the psychological impact of those BBC broadcasts that had sustained 43 men through their determination not to be forgotten. Private Sullivan, the kid from Boston who'd questioned whether anyone still remembered they existed, was among the first to be processed for return to the United States. Before leaving, he sought out McNiece for a conversation that would stay with both men for the rest of their lives. "Sarge," Sullivan said, his voice carrying a maturity that 6 months earlier would have been unimaginable. "I wanted you to know that radio saved more than our morale. It saved who we were. Without it, I think we would have stopped being soldiers and just become numbers in a camp." The observation struck McNiece as profoundly true. The radio had provided more than news. It had maintained their connection to the identity that had carried them through airborne training, combat drops, and the brutal reality of hedgerow fighting in Normandy. By refusing to accept isolation, they had preserved something essential about themselves that neither German propaganda nor the grinding routine of captivity could destroy. Years later, long after his return to Oklahoma and the gradual adjustment to civilian life that never quite felt complete, McNiece would remember not the explosive charges that had earned him his reputation, but the delicate electronic components that had held 43 men's spirits together through their darkest hours. The improvised radio, built from scraps and stubbornness, had proven more powerful than any demolition charge, capable of destroying despair itself. The device sat on a shelf in his workshop, no longer functional, but still carrying the weight of memories that official histories would never capture. Sometimes, during thunderstorms that reminded him of those nights in Stalag 7A, McNiece would hold the crude speaker and remember Weber's words about enemies who were also engineers, building useful things in a world that too often celebrated only destruction. The true measure of courage, he'd learned, wasn't always found in dramatic moments of combat heroism that made good stories for recruitment posters. Sometimes it appeared in the quiet determination to maintain hope when everything rational suggested surrender, to build connections when authority demanded isolation, to trust in human decency when experience counseled cynicism. His radio had become a bridge across more than just enemy lines. It had connected past and future, memory and hope. The man he'd been in Normandy with, the man he would become in the decades that followed. The legend that survived in military history spoke of demolitions and daring raids, but McNiece knew that his most important construction had been built not with TNT and detonation cord, but with copper wire, and the stubborn refusal to let good men's spirits collapse under the weight of enforced despair. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.